Good morning, everyone. My name is Mulry Mondelice from Royal Military College Saint Jean, where I am an associate professor. We're here for this panel on international migration, border control and walls. We're pleased to welcome you and to welcome our panelists on sounding topics and very challenging issues regarding international migration, border controls and walls, as well as strategies of migrants, organizations that work with migrants, and with the news and states' stance on migration policy today. We have some particular and interesting case studies from the Horn of Africa, and it will be our colleague from Hassan University, Soukaina, Aouaki, a case study on the Dominican and US stance on anti-Haitianism and other consideration we'll be having on this case. The other presentation by our colleague Sarah from Texas State University on immobility and security and asylum seeking at the US-Mexico border. The last presentation will be on mediatization and fortification of international border parks along the Canada-US border. So in the order of presentation, I will give now the floor to my colleague, Masaya Llavaneras Blanco. I'm sorry if I mispronounce the name, on Between the Walls and Another, anti-Haitianism and walls making on the Dominican Republic and the US. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. So my name is Masaya Llavaneras Blanco. I work at the Center for Global Studies at Huron University, at the University of Western Ontario. Today, I'm sharing with you some work in progress. So this is not a full paper, this is work I'm thinking about. And the presentation is entitled Between a Wall and Another, Anti-Haitianism and Containment in the Dominican Republic and the US. I've been doing field work in the Dominican Republic's border with Haiti for the past 9 years, on and off. And through my work, I've been also teasing out some of the histories that lead to the border that is there and the border wall that is being built. And I'm trying to tease those histories together in the project I will be talking about. So just so we contextualize, to the right of the screen, you can see a picture that you probably remember from the news in 2020. This is US border stopping a group of Haitian migrants trying to get into the US. And then to the left side, you see first in the upper side, a picture of the border wall being built in the Dominican Republic. That's from 2019, when I first saw the wall in process. The wall was started in 2019. The picture is from 2022. And same border, same wall. 2 years later is right in the picture below, where you're seeing a picture that is telling a similar story to the US side picture. It's a truck bringing in and dropping off Haitian deportees from the DR into the Haitian side of the border. So these borders, I'm not claiming, are necessarily coming from the same logic. I don't have proof of this at this point. But there is a long history of shared border policies between the two sides that I want to explore. I'm thinking about this in terms of containment in particular, thinking of the legal, ideational, and physical practices of controlling access, controlling mobilities, and use of space. And in the case of Haiti and Haitians, there's a logic of keeping Haitians in place while enabling conditional and precarious access to place and belonging For a long time, I worked with this idea of obscene inclusion, building on the Genova, and narrowing this specifically to the case of the DR, the Dominican Republic. I think of the logics behind this based on the ideology of anti-Haitianism, which is a form of anti-Blackness that emerged in the Dominican Republic in the context of the Trujillo dictatorship, which frames the unification of Haiti and the DR, which happened in the 19th century, as a reminder of a threat that Haiti represents to the Dominican sovereignty and the Dominican nation. There is a shared origin story to how that particular border of Hispaniola, which is the name of the whole island, the border politics of the island specifically linked to the US, indirectly through the US mandate of early 20th century when the sugar economy enclave was developed in the Dominican Republic, and the US indirectly oversaw the creation of the customs system between the two countries, the border demarcations of 1912, and they started to set up a racialized migration system in 1912. The US occupies the island at different times, depending on the side, but something that happens during the occupation of the totality of the island is the creation of a labor migration model that links directly the mobilities of Haitians, specifically poor Haitians, into the enclave economy that was being created. So it becomes clear that there is a link between the economic model, the racialization of labor, and the way migration was being regulated and imagined in the country. Is remarkable for us in this case is the 1919 legislation that criminalizes migration of Haitians outside of labor migration in the DR, with prison, deportation, and hefty fines. This history predates the present and kind of indicates many of the practices that we continue to see. And I'm just going to fly through this because we only have 10 minutes. Before the wall that we started with emerged, there have been different strategies of containment that are relevant to the function of the wall. Bodies and embodiments being a key one. In the case of the US, relationship with Haitians through the designation of Haitians as a high-risk group in 1982 in the context of the HIV pandemic or epidemic, which lasted up until 2013. So it looks like old history, but it's quite current. And in the case of the Dominican Republic, to name one particular case, of course, the long history of forced deportations, but very much in particular today, from 2021 till the present, the deportation rates being carried out in maternity wards. So particularly seeking out women who just delivered babies or are about to deliver babies. Only in April, since after April 10, above 3,000 women have been deported, which is in violation of Dominican law, but we can talk about the details of how this is legitimated as a state action. So again, before the brick and mortar wall, there has been a long-standing practice of containment through the control of bodies directly. And another key aspect in the way the containment of Haitians has been taking place in both sides, the US and the Dominican Republic, is through paper containment strategies. The negation of asylum for Haitians is notorious. The Dominican Republic has accepted maybe 2 refugees in the last 2 decades. There's no recognition of requests of asylum from Haitians or people in general. The US itself has had these ways of moving beyond the right of asylum, and in the case of Haitians, they create the TPS model, which is a precarious and conditional way of accepting the presence of Haitians, Venezuelans, Salvadorians. This is a strategy they use for specific populations in the DR. The case of these conditionalities is applied in the context of precarious and temporary regularization processes that do not guarantee the right to work, do not guarantee renewal. So you happen to see processes of regularization that expire and people are left in illegality once again. Two aspects that are central to this, and I think it's relevant to both cases, is the questioning or the diluting of birthright citizenship, which is now a discussion in the context of the US that emerged with the current administration. But in the Dominican Republic, I think they've developed a practice that is actually useful for the current US government through the changing of the terms of birthright citizenship, which is targeting, again, Dominicans of Haitian descent. So this paper containment tool in particular regulates and more questions the right to belong and of belonging. So as I'm thinking about this, I'm thinking about border wall, this particular border wall in the Dominican Republic as part of a transnational and multi-layered containment process that, of course, involves physical infrastructure, but that physical infrastructure comes into a long-standing process of containment, centering bodies and centering legal and legislative and even informal government practices as well, because the law, before the law comes to be, there are practices that have created the conditions for these legislations to exist. What I find also interesting here is that this is not unique to the US and the Dominican Republic, although I see these two as the bookends of transnational or continental system of containment that is targeting Haitians in particular and denying access to protection. Balaguer et al. Have been working on this. They talk about a hemispheric frontier regime that they define as a racial regime that displaces, funnels, repels, criminalizes, and denies protection to Haitians across the Americas. And they work specifically on the cases of Brazil, Colombia, and Mexico. And again, the strategies are similar: the precarity of status, the non-recognition of refugee claims, the creation of humanitarian visas, for example, in the case of Brazil, the non-accounting of Haitian people walking through Colombia, for example. And Mexico is, I think, a more complex case in this particular context, thinking of both the creation of these precarious statuses or moments of increased deportation. So it's like it shifts. So these strategies are shared across the Americas and yet created and sustained, I think, through the two bookends, the Dominican and the US extremes of the process. This is what I've got to share. I'd love to go more into detail in the question section. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We're turning to the second presentation on border crossing and mobility in the Horn of Africa. Thank you.
Well, while waiting for the PowerPoint, good morning. Let's just talk a little bit so that we're just feeling a little bit the void. So good morning, my name is Soukaina Aouaki, and I'm from the University of Hassan II, Casablanca, Morocco. I'm very much pleased to be here, and finally I made it to come here to Montreal and be amongst you here this morning. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to be here yesterday. My flight I landed yesterday at night, but I'm pretty much sure that it was a success. So my presentation today is about border crossing and mobility in the Horn of Africa between trauma and resilience. In this presentation, I will be talking, after the introduction, of course, I will be talking about borders in Ethiopia, the context and the problem, what's going on in Ethiopia, and then borders in Ethiopia, Djibouti, Yemen, and Saudi Arabia as sites of trauma, and then we will be finishing with a conclusion. So in the era marked by high mobility and large-scale migration, borders and border crossing have merged as a focal point of scholarly and political attention. So diverse forms of borders, be it geopolitical, cultural, racial, and also linguistic, have generated a range of continuous and often conflict-laden dynamics. As a friend of mine and a colleague of mine used to refer to borders simply as a empty signifier or a floating signifier, meaning that borders carry shifting meanings that are shaped by historical, social, and political contexts. Today, the topic is basically the representation of borders, and the question to be asked is, what does border mean to Ethiopians? As a case study, I will be analyzing a documentary, which is called The Desperate Journey of Ethiopian Migrant to Saudi Arabia. And here is the map here of Ethiopia. So as you see, Ethiopia is a landlocked country located in the Eastern Africa, bordered by Djibouti, Eritrea, Kenya, Somalia, and Sudan. So basically, in 2023, it was home to around 128 million inhabitants, making it the 13th most populous country in the world and the second most populous in Africa and after Nigeria, and the most populous landlocked country on earth. So you can imagine how the situation is there. So basically the national capital of the country is Addis Ababa. And in the last 5 years, over 800,000 Ethiopians have moved to other countries to pursue work opportunities, and these migrants were sent approximately 510 million money back to their home, Ethiopia, in 2022. So both push and pull factors induced improvement out of the country, including high unemployment rates, family obligation, droughts, and other natural disasters, so as well as overseas national networks. So basically, in addition to movements within the border of Horn of Africa, Ethiopian migrants tend to move along 3 routes. Some people also call it routes. So either from the eastern route through Yemen to the Middle East, or they take the northern routes through Sudan, typically onto Europe, or the southern route through Kenya, Tanzania, and South Africa. So here is a graph here that shows the mobility between 2008 and 2013, and you will see that the percentage of female is a little bit quite higher, and most of them work as housemaid, 100% in Oman, 81.8 in Lebanon, and 75.5 in Kuwait. So this presentation attempts to shed light on the immigration, both of men and women, but also children. So who, for some reason, resort to illegal migration and also shared traumas on their journey, trespassing the borders for a better yet unknown future. So since leaving the country is restricted, and also there are a lot of restrictions over visa, people, they tend to go the illegal way. So as I said, the case study is called The Desperate Journey of Ethiopia. It was filmed in September 2019. And basically, it's a documentary that portrays the situation of Ethiopian migrants who cross borders to arrive to Saudi Arabia. And probably you will see that the title is quite very telling. It's a journey, but not a journey of hope. It's a desperate journey. And if you want to watch the documentary, you can find it on France 24, that was posted in February 2020. But also BBC in 2021, the BBC Africa Eye, To Make It or We Die, it's also available on YouTube. So let's have a look at the summary. So basically, thousands of Ethiopians embark on a 2,000 kilometers journey on foot every day within the goal of reaching Saudi Arabia for a better living conditions. So along their journey, they will pass through Yemen, a nation devastated by civil war, the Red Sea, and the deserts of Djibouti. So a few of these migrants talk about how in 50 degrees weather, they encountered robbery, extortion, and famine. Some fail and wind up as street beggars, and many others, they pass away either on the sea or dehydrated. So each year, hundreds of people drown while crossing the Gulf of Aden or pass away, as I said, dehydrated. So after starving for days so those people who manage to arrive to Yemen, sometimes they fall in the hands of mafia and smugglers. So basically, I think that this documentary offers a room for the unvoiced to let themselves heard and uncover the truth of their sufferings and the sufferings they have undergone. So the documentary interviews migrants, as I said, men, women, and children who succeed to trespass the borders or who are still in the journey to Saudi Arabia. The mass exodus of waves of illegal migrants escaping the country towards the unknown, most of them are teens and unoccupied children. So here are some pictures of those migrants crossing the desert of Djibouti. So you see that it's quite hostile and it's not really something that people can stand, especially in a 50-degree weather on foot. So as I said, there are some push factors, which are economical, educational, social, and political reasons. So all these problems find illustrations in the documentary. Therefore, because I said for visa restrictions, there is no way but resorting to illegal ones. So here the question is it really good to do so? Are we going to sympathize with these people, or are we going to find legitimacy to what they are actually doing? And here I'd like to share with you some testimonies. Here one of the migrants who was interviewed, he said there are no jobs in Ethiopia, so we left. The other thing, we will go all the way to Saudi Arabia to find work. As we find a job here in Djibouti, we will take it. So we see no matter where they can find a job, it's their home. And I would like also to share with you the routes. So they start from Ethiopia to Djibouti, then crossing the Red Sea to arrive to Yemen, then through Yemen to Saudi Arabia. In the documentary, they have interviewed 100 Ethiopians. However, only 20 were used in the documentary. So these are some of the testimonies. The first one that I will be sharing with you is Mustafa Jamal, who is an ex-migrant who succeeded to cross the borders of Ethiopia to arrive to Saudi Arabia, but he was sent back by the police of the borders. So basically, Mustafa, just like many other migrants, wanted to escape the hardships of life in Ethiopia. So for him, there was no plan and little money, so he took a deadly road to Saudi Arabia and escaped for better opportunities. He is considered as one survivor of this journey, so he turned home and kept telling everyone not to embark in this deadly journey. However, people didn't listen, and all of them, they keep on aspiring to succeed in this mission. One of the children who was interviewed is Nasru. Nasru is a 12-year-old boy who found himself obliged to dislocate and survive. So as you can see here, he said that we couldn't pay the rent and we were kicked out of the house. So he was just asked by the reporter whether or what are the main reasons. For him, it was just to escape misery of life. There was also this woman who was unnamed in the documentary. And here she was just talking about her hardship facing the civil war in Yemen. She was talking about her skin being burned. She was talking about suffering from thirst, from rape, and also from starvation. In the documentary, they have also interviewed smugglers, people who, if you have money, they can take you using trucks to cross the desert of Djibouti. So one of them is called Lushin. He's a former people smuggler in Djibouti. So he said that traffickers who are from an ethnic group that is called Tigrayans, so they use cars and trucks to cross the desert of Djibouti. The other tribe of Ethiopia called the Oromos, because of poor means, they cross on foot, and most of them, they perish, as I said, dehydrated. So they take the road into the Yemen. If they don't die in the desert, they would die crossing the sea, because they will find themselves on a boat with 150 people. So it's really quite hard. So as I said here, either they perish with weather, famine, war, etc. So here are some pictures that I want to say. There are some people who work there. They just sell soda, they sell water on site. Here, there is one testimony of one who he had the deal with the smugglers to pay the money, but once they're arriving at the borders, the smugglers impose extra money on them. So if they don't find themselves able to pay, they will remain stuck in the borders. So many of them, they just talk about being perishing. Now, because I don't have much time, I will just jump to borders. There are different types of borders in the documentary. The first border is this one. The second one is the desert of the Djibouti, and also the sea. So one can left thinking whether borders signify signs of hope or trauma. So basically the representation of borders in this context is a little bit iconic and paradoxical, because it might allude to freeing a nation and people who are thirsty of freedom, but also it also alludes to the fact that it locks people and scatter their dreams to the extent that to imprison and enslave them. So while some nations engaging in war establish borders to mark their independence and freedom, others, on the other hand, they find it a source of misery, trauma, and torture. So in fact, borders here that we are talking about are not just fixed borders, but imaginary borders. So to fill in the void, if I am to borrow Homi Bhabha's The Third Space, so here people, they are no longer just facing the trauma of the physical borders, but they are still kept with psychological or imaginary border, if I am to borrow Salman Rushdie's Imaginary Homeland. So basically, we can also be left by the following question: how is healing possible for those who have failed the journey and come back with the trauma and the painful memory? Another question also can be asked, which is the extent to which those people cross the borders being trespassed in their mind. So the crossing the physical borders, we talked about it, but what about the psychological ones? So I think we can notice here that there's a duality between the physical borders and the psychological one. Therefore, the documentary provides the example of Mustafa and many other migrants who managed to cross the border physically, yet borders are still uncrossed in their mind. Just like Mustafa, many others are stuck in the borders existing in their memory and being truly freed from the trauma. So here we are left with a picture of Mustafa at the end of the documentary, saying that the situation is very appalling and he is left in a loop or a cycle of unending trauma. Right. So to conclude, borders. Can we think of borders as gateways of hope, or borders as now being landscape of wounds? I think that for these people, it's more landscape of wounds and trauma, since they are left with some feelings that are violence, because they undergo violence, they undergo imprisonment, they undergo a lot of physical abuse at the borders, either by the security or by the smugglers. They also kind of fall victims to a lot of policies that are implemented on some countries. And the last thing that I'm going to conclude with is a sentence that I used to hear from a professor of mine, who told us the most anxious people are those who wait. So you can imagine how these people wait every time at each border, waiting for the smugglers to transport them, waiting to flee the police, the border of the police of the borders, waiting to arrive at the shore of each country in order to finally be in the land of the promised land that they are striving to arrive to. And having said so, I would like to thank you for your attention. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I'm now turning to Dr. Abdellah for her presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'll also just say hello while the PowerPoint comes up, but it's so nice to be here. This is the first time at this conference for me, and it's lovely. I've learned so much from all of you, and I really appreciate the opportunity to share my research. Okay, so today I'll be talking about immobility, insecurity, and asylum seeking at the US-Mexico border, and focusing on two things, policy-related: border management and the externalization of enforcement at the US border, and how that impacts migrants. So this is part of a larger project that an NSF-funded project on geographies of migration and insecurity, and there were 6 of us, George Washington, UTRGV, and Texas State, and we, together with 10 students, we collected 153 interviews at the border of migrants who were either, we looked at the twin cities of Reynosa and McAllen, and Brownsville and Matamoros, and we went to shelters in all 4 of those places in 5 different trips. And most of the interviews were done in Spanish, although we had a grad student from Benin who did some interviews with Haitians in French. So I'm going to focus on the journey and shifts in the journey in the last, especially post-COVID, starting in 2019. Then there was an interruption with COVID, and then, but the journey has shifted dramatically in this last 5 to 10 year period, including who's migrating, the shifting routes of the migration, the role of organized crime, the coyotaje, so the guides and the smuggling that we were just hearing about in the Horn of Africa. And then I'll focus especially on these two facets of border immigration policy, which are border management and then externalization of the border. And so, first of all, to highlight the shift, it used to be that people thought of migrants crossing the US-Mexico border as mostly single Mexican men or Central American men, and they were trying to cross undetected. And now we've seen a real shift to large groups of families migrating together, or just large groups of people whose intent is to seek safe haven. I sometimes avoid saying asylum because it's a legal process, and some of them, we'd ask them, do you plan to seek asylum? And they didn't even know what that was, but they do know that they want to get to the US for safety, right? And so you can see in this graph that, the little dip at the first is Mexican, Central Americans, and then it's the COVID, and then you see the tremendous diversification. I read recently there were over 90 countries represented in people who are crossing the border. Okay, and as we were reminded yesterday, it is legal to seek asylum in the United States under international and US law. And these migrants were increasingly presenting themselves. They were crossing over and then looking for the first CBP agent that they could find to turn themselves in so they could begin the process of credible fear to be able to stay in the United States and seek asylum. And also the context is there's very few ways, and they've been narrowed for the last 20 to 30 years, of legal mechanisms to be able to come into the US, right? So for many people who didn't have a visa and don't have access to the limited categories of being able to migrate to the United States, this was the main way that people were able to come, is just to show up at the border and ask to come in. And I'm not, just in the interest of time, I'm not talking about all the structural reasons that people are fleeing their homes, but, a lot of structural reasons for that, right? And terrible conditions in their home countries. So, I put up a few news articles to kind of remind everyone of the situation. And, we heard a bit about Haitians before, but there was there were all these people showing up, hundreds of thousands of people showing up at the US-Mexico border for a variety of reasons. And the US used these policies, I call them border management, because really, the Biden administration didn't look good to have all these people. And why were they there? It's the context of COVID, the end of COVID, during COVID-19. And so a lot of, especially Haitians, Venezuelans, were living in South America, right? They were already living there, and then they were losing jobs, they were losing opportunities, they were being pushed out. And so they came up to the US-Mexico border. Yeah, so I'm trying to go fast here. But so before Title 42, and to not go into, I assume you guys are familiar, but Title 42 was a mechanism where the US closed the border, supposedly for health reasons. But so during that time, under Biden, starting in January 2021, he started allowing a lot of people to come in through humanitarian exceptions. So people who were exceptionally vulnerable were allowed to come in. And then, I won't talk as much about the CHNV parole program, but that was a mechanism to try and get people to not go to the border at all for 4 countries: Cuba, Haiti, Nicaragua, Venezuela. And these were countries that were focused on because their governments were not allowing them they weren't allowing the US to deport people back to those countries because they didn't have diplomatic relations and they didn't want to play the game that the US was playing. And Mexico was refusing entry for those people. So they had all these people who were kind of stranded there. And so this is part of the border management, is what do we do with all these people who we can't deport immediately, and Mexico won't take them back, right? There's a lot more details to this, of course. When Title 42 ended, then the US rolled out the CBP-1 appointment system. And so people would wait in Mexico. You had to be in Mexico to apply for CBP-1. So you had all these people from all these countries coming up to Mexico, applying for CBP-1 appointment. And then once they got their appointment, and it could be up to 6 or 9 months waiting for their appointment. Once they got the appointment, they would get a notice to appear, and that would start their process in the immigration court in the United States. So they were immediately put into deportation proceedings, which a lot of people was a shock to them, right? Finally made it, and now they're in the process of deportation, right? At the same time, the US put into place policies to narrow access to asylum. So at the same time that Title 42 ended, they put in this circumvention of legal pathways rule, where if you crossed anywhere between the ports of entry, so people had been just crossing anywhere, and presenting themselves to CBP officers, instead, the circumvention of lawful pathways rule said that if you don't go through CBP 1 and you don't go through an appointment and a port of entry, you cannot apply for asylum. And then they strengthened that with the asylum ban in June 2024. At the same time, then the Biden administration really leaned on visa restrictions to try and stop the flow, stop people from being able to arrive to U.S. territory to ask for asylum, right? And so a lot of, the first Trump administration had used a lot of tools, including Title 42, remain in Mexico. There's a long history of deterrence policies trying to externalize the border, but Biden really leaned heavily on restricting visas. Right? And so, it's effectively using threats and international collaboration agreements to get pressure countries to, stop allowing visa-free travel and shifting border enforcement further south. Things like adding checkpoints, detaining, deporting people before they even got to the United States, right? So this was especially true for Venezuela, and you can see this news report from July 2022. In January 2022, Mexico stopped visa-free travel for Venezuelans. So this is why you saw so many people coming through the Darien Gap, is because they couldn't fly, right? So they didn't have another option. So it's very interesting to track, when people, of course, you would take a bus or you would fly if you could, but they didn't have those avenues available to them. So for Haiti, there's no country in the Americas that allows Haiti visa-free travel anymore. And over time, the US has pressured different countries to stop allowing visa-free. They've not successfully pressured Nicaragua, so Cubans can fly into Nicaragua, but even Venezuelans are not able to fly through Nicaragua. Okay, and so Mexico, some of the things that the US has, sort of pressured Mexico into accepting, and so Mexico started with deployment of its National Guard. I was just in Tapachula, the border of Mexico and Guatemala, and they're everywhere, the National Guard, and then also in northern Mexico along the border, it's just swarming with National Guard, and heavily armed, et cetera. And so also doing increased detention, deportations, increased checkpoints, roadblocks, rail monitoring. These are all opportunities to, to pick up migrants, rob them, harass them, take away their documents sometimes, and send them back to the south. Some of the similar to the stories that we just heard, right? And geographer Kendra McSweeney at Ohio State calls this prohibition geography. He's talking about the drug trade and drug trafficking. But really, and one of the people we interviewed said, anytime you have something illegal, that's the cartels control it, right? And so if you look at the map here, this is the territories, talking about the keynote this morning, territories of control. And so if you think of this as migrant groups who are traversing through this territory, the cartels control all the illegal activity that goes on in their territories, right? And so they want to cut. And so if you make something illegal, before when the early people were coming up in cartels, Mexicans were helping them out, right? Mexico has a long tradition of helping migrants. But when everything became illegal and you couldn't help people, then the cartels moved in, right? And so we have lots and lots of stories of people who were traumatized in Mexico through these constant stops and checkpoints where they would get shaken down and robbed and extorted. Oh, and so 26% of the 69 people we talked to in May of 2024 had been kidnapped or escaped a kidnapping attempt, and several people it was very, very hard interviews. This was on the Mexico side, were telling us that they got their CBP-1 interview, they sold everything, they're doing everything right, they sold all of their things, they're finally going to the US legally, they get to the border, they go up, they're on their way to their CBP-1 appointment, and they get kidnapped by the cartels. And they miss their appointment. They had to pay like $2,000 each to get out, a family of 5. Right? So they have it takes time to get that money. And then they go back to CBP and they say, we missed our appointment, we were kidnapped. They say, sorry, nothing we can do. You have to start over. So imagine how devastating that is. To wrap up, so, that's a great quote about waiting and the anxiety and the suffering. So a lot of our research has been about immobility and the impacts of immobility, right? And so these, by extending the border south and the enforcement measures south creates all these new places, these new spaces of vulnerability and waiting, right? So transit points, checkpoints, even the sites of protection like shelters and immigration processing centers become places where migrants are victimized. They're overcharged, they're lied to, they're robbed, etc. Right? And so any system that involves waiting, including the CBP-1, where people are forced to wait in Mexico, is problematic, right? Okay, let me just skip ahead to the conclusion. I'm right on the conclusion. So obviously there's, a need for permanent migration. All these CBP-1 people that came in are now notified that they no longer have legal permission to be in the US and they have to leave under Trump, which is very traumatizing. But the externalization of border enforcement, the illegalization of their mobility has led to heightened migrant vulnerability and enriched organized crime, right? And one positive thing is that a lot of Mexicans were allowed a chance to get in legally to the United States and request asylum, but this disproportionately favored countries without diplomatic relations with the US. So Haiti, Venezuela, Nicaragua, Cuba, had more opportunities to come in legally than other countries. And I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and I hope we'll have some time to discuss some of the interesting question raises in those presentations. The last presentation gathers 2 panelists from the Border Policy Research Institute of Western Washington University, Andréanne Bissonnette and Jennifer Bettis. You have the floor for 10, 12 minutes. Thanks.
Today we're going to discuss the mediatization and fortification of international border parks along the Canada-US border. Our paper is a work in progress that will offer an analysis as to why the Peace Arch Park has been the focus of increased securitization, while the other 2 cross-border parks have yet to be targeted with similar heightened security measures. So just to set the stage, the Peace Arch Park is one of 3 parks and many anomalies along the Canada-US border that have stood as official and unofficial symbols of the close relationship between the 2 neighbors. These spaces exemplify a sustained cross-border relationship that's anchored in cooperation and collaboration between all levels of governance, at least until quite recently. So when entering Peace Arch Park, one is greeted with the words, "May these gates never be closed." The words are etched into a white arch built in 1921 to commemorate the signing of the 1814 Treaty of Ghent and symbolize peace between the 2 neighboring countries. Over the last 25 years, there have been a few crises that have led to pushes in heightened security and elevated discourses that have shifted the tone, focus, and policy at and beyond the Canada-US border. So the first of these is the terrorist attacks on September 11th in the United States, which triggered changes to how both countries address security issues at the border. The second arises from the 2018 sharp increase in asylum seekers arriving at Roxham Road to cross into Canada using a loophole in the Safe Third Country Agreement. And thirdly, the COVID-19 pandemic prompted Canada and the United States to jointly restrict non-essential travel between the 2 countries, including at the land border, for almost 18 months starting in March 2020. More recently, with the election of Donald Trump, that has created some more disruption in the cross-border dynamics. Threats of tariffs and calls for Canada to become the 51st state have impacted cross-border dynamics and relationships. The consequences of such dynamics have been unequal on spaces that are inherently binational, with certain areas becoming the focus of heightened interest and security discourses, including Peace Arch Park. So I'll set the stage of the three parks before handing it off to Andréanne to go over three events or realities that have created a window of opportunity for Peace Arch Park to be securitized. So the first is Peace Arch Park, then International Peace Garden, and then Parc de la Frontière. So these are just pictures, the arch on the left there, and then the International Peace Garden in the middle, and then the Parc de la Frontière on my right. So Peace Arch is set between Vancouver and Seattle. The park enjoys a high level of news coverage, particularly during the pandemic. It's organized by an international Peace Arch organization, and that manages all of the binational activities. The second, the Peace Garden between Manitoba and North Dakota. There's parking on either side of the border, and visitors are required to have valid passport with them at all times as they crisscross the border while visiting the park. There's regular programming that's binational in nature, including 2 youth summer camps, and it enjoys varying levels of news coverage, not as much as Peace Arch though. And then finally, Parc de la Frontière is on the border between Quebec and Maine, and it offers very limited infrastructure for visitors. There's a few picnic tables and informational boards that offer people a place to sit and have lunch. There's no advertised binational activities, and there's very limited online presence for this particular park.
So I will take over for the next few minutes, and I'll present 3 different events or dynamics that have created a window of opportunity as to why Peace Arch Park have been the focus of security measures in the past few years, while the other 2 parks have remained untouched by those same pressures. So the first act is the COVID-19 pandemic. So I will bring you back to that period that I'm sure everyone wants to forget. But during the pandemic, the Canada-US border, as mentioned, was quote-unquote closed to non-essential travel for a long time, and it included family reunification. So there are a lot of families along the Canada-US border that are binational. Some have houses on both sides, and they usually travel back and forth to see one another. That all shut down in March of 2020. And in those long months, the Peace Arch Park became a meeting point and a meeting place for cross-border families. So you would have people coming from the US side of the park, and then Canadians would literally jump the ditch to get into the park, and they could get together, have picnics, barbecues, family events. Some people were staying for the whole day, some people were staying for a shorter period of times. And Peace Arch, its reputation was further strengthened, and its visibility was also strengthened by the fact that it is located between Seattle and Vancouver, so easily accessible for people who also resided outside of the border region. So you would have families from Alberta and other places in the US meet at that specific point as it got more and more media attention. It does become a unique place along the border, and although under constant surveillance, there was a tolerance from both the CBP officers and the RCMP officers for those types of meetings. However, by being so unique and popular, Peace Arch Park also became highly visible during the COVID-19 pandemic. And that leads me to the second act, which is the 2024 elections. As we move a bit away from the border, I will invite you to keep in mind the aspect of high visibility of Peace Arch as I move through the next few elements. So during the 2024 elections, immigration and borders were central to political discourses, with both candidates traveling to the US-Mexico border. However, the US-Canada border was not very present in discourses, with the exception of J.D. Vance, who mentioned a few times the Canada-US border and wanting to have heightened security along the US-Canada border. However, it didn't get any media traction, and it kind of like fell on the back burner for a bit there. However, in the beginning of November 2024, just a few days before the election, the Canada-US border came back into the narrative with threats of tariffs linked to perceived lack of the border security along the Canada-US border. The following election of Donald Trump in November, coupled with those threats that were now perceived as very real on the Canadian side, pushed Canada to invest in security security measures at the border. On the ground in Peace Arch Park, the focus on border security in political discourse, even though the US-Mexico border was predominant, created an opportunity for local actors who had been pushing for some higher level of security for a while, and they saw this national discourse to strengthen borders as an opportunity to push for higher security in Peace Arch. And so we saw in the past year new signage and heightened visibility of border agents in the park, and that became part of the experience of visiting Peace Arch Park. So as you can see on the photo, you have a bunch of boards with notices, and on the photo on the bottom, you see one is hidden in the bush, as if someone would crawl through a bush to get to the park. The last element is that Peace Arch Park, as opposed to the other two parks, is a very perfect visual. So the Parc de la Frontière is isolated, it's small, and you have to drive in front of the point of entry to get to the park. So you cannot go unnoticed, whereas International Peace Garden is the complete opposite, with a lot of infrastructure, and so, again, hard to go unnoticed when you're entering that park. Whereas the Peace Arch Park is kind of an in-between of those, where you have the arch that is very visible, and you also have another park that is solely on the US side that Canadian access by jumping the ditch at the border. And so it became the perfect visual symbol of closing the border and having a heightened security that is very visible, and that it makes it look like the US is taking care of what it perceives to be an open border, and that by closing the park, quote unquote, closing the park, it would be a symbolic gesture at a time where they equate undefended borders with insecure borders. As such, the combination of a pandemic that rendered the park visible outside of the Cascadia region, an election cycle during which anti-immigration and pro-border security discourses took center stage, and a geographical composition that made it the perfect symbol, created a window opportunity for local actors to push for heightened and more visible border security.
All right, so just to conclude, our work will include continuing our analysis of these three moments in time through the lens of securitization, society of risk, and the Mexicanization of the Canada-US border. The reason we're doing this research is to ultimately understand the process of hardening the border and what events or moments in time might be indicators to be aware of. We conclude by asking, is Peace Arch the canary in the mine that alerts us to further security-focused approaches on the Canada-US border? And if so, will this be unilaterally, or is it something that both neighbors are interested in pursuing? Thank you.
Thank you very much, everybody. If the panelists, you have nothing to add, I'd like to thank you, and we can pursue our conversation during the lunchtime.